It's my pleasure to introduce to you this brother and sister duo who are going to take us through tonight's session. Sriyan Pietersz, class of 82, and Ruvanee Pietersz Vilhauer, class of 81. Now, I know I came to KIS at 85, so I completely missed these two wonderful people. So I had to actually turn into their Yuki write-ups to give you a bit of an insider information about what they were like in school. Sorry, Sriyan and Ruvanee, nothing embarrassing here. You can immediately spot Sriyan on campus, a prim, proper, and deep in thought. He's an ex-boxer with a John Travolta back brush with every hair in place. His favorite pastime is reading books and doing nothing. He is known to be a bit of a prankster, so let's watch out tonight, everyone. Sriyan, after Cody, moved to the US and pursued an interest in ancient history, classics, and archaeology. But soon his career morphed, taking him into a 30-year career in capital markets and investment, where he works as an analyst and macro strategist, now in Bangkok. So it's pretty late for Sriyan tonight. And thank you, Sriyan, for joining us. Nonetheless, he has maintained his interest in history and literature, and that makes him a perfect candidate to be sitting right across his sister Ruvanee today. Ruvanee, on the other hand, is described in 82 as someone who was fun, charming, and a sunny Ceylonese aura. And I don't think she's any different today. Ruvanee's journey after Cody took her to gain her PhD in psychology from the University of Chicago, worked as a science writer and therapist in many settings, including prisons. Her career until recently led her to teach psychology at New York University, but writing has always been the background of Ruvanee's work. She started with short stories in BBC radio broadcast and many publications, including The Stand and American Literary Review. Her collection of short stories, The Water Diviner and Other Stories, was published in 2018, and she won the Iowa Short Fiction Award that same year. The book was also shortlisted for the Story Prize Award in 2018. Ruvanee's debut thriller novel, The Mask Collector, was published in 2019 and named by Crime Reads as one of the most anticipated books of the season. Ruvanee, Sriyan, it is extremely exciting to have both of you tonight, and I really look forward to tuning with everyone here and getting a chance to interact with you and prick your brains a little. All right, over to you, Sriyan.
Great, thanks, Manjusha. Nice to be here, and thanks for the introduction. Thanks everyone also for joining us for this discussion today. It's a great pleasure for both of us to be on here, and hopefully I'll be able to help you guys get some insights into what Ruvanee's been up to. Manjusha gave you the backdrop to her writing career so far, but before we begin, let me give you a brief outline of how we're going to run the discussion. And we'll first start with a bit of background, general background on her writing, and then we'll follow up with more specific questions on the individual books. And finally, we'll wind up by talking about some of her current projects. And after that, we'll open up to question and answers from the audience. And Manjusha has promised to help curate that discussion a bit as well. Before I start, I'm going to be referring to Ruvanee as Pony, and just to give you an idea of why that's the case. In our family, she was always known as Poddi, which is a shortened form of Podiakki, which is little big sister, because I've got two big sisters, and she's the second one. But 25 years ago, when my niece came along, she couldn't pronounce Poddi, and so she shortened it to Pony, and she's been Pony ever since. So we all call her Pony. Okay. So without any further preamble, let's just dive right into the discussion now. Pony, maybe we'll kick off with this one. What brought you into writing, particularly fiction? Your academic background is in the sciences, your academic discipline is psychology. So I don't think it's immediately evident to anyone how you ended up as a writing of fiction. Were there any specific influences that you can pinpoint and the time when you made the decision to go down the road of writing full-time?
Okay, so first I want to thank Manjusha also and Sylvia and the KIS Alumni Association for inviting us and for setting up this series of talks. As I was saying to Manjusha, I think it's a great idea and I'm really looking forward to upcoming talks with other alumni. And thank you all, the rest of you also, for being here. It's so nice to connect with people from KIS. So the question of writing, I've been writing since I was a teenager, Mali, as you know, but I didn't even start thinking about writing full-time until very recently. In my mind, writing was always something you did as a hobby. You know, I wrote because I sort of felt compelled to do it. You know, it was relaxing and I just enjoyed it. And it was something that was an outlet for what I was thinking and observing. I was interested in science from the beginning, particularly biology. So that was where I intended my career to be. And what I wanted to do was study the connection between the body and the mind. But when I was doing, so I continued on in psychology, in biology for a while. And then when I was doing a master's degree at UT Austin, this was in molecular genetics, I found that I was spending all my time in the lab. I was interested in how genes influence behavior, but the work really seemed to have nothing to do with people. So that's why eventually I decided to go into psychology, where I could combine my interest in science with my interest in people's behavior. But all through my psychology career, I continued to write continued my creative writing just as a hobby. And then in 2004, I won the Commonwealth Short Story Competition for a story that I had sent in. And that was a shocker. I didn't expect that at all. So after that, I thought maybe I should try to get a short story published in a literary journal. I had no idea how to go about doing this because at the time I didn't know any writers at all. I had no models, you know, for what a writer did or how to do it. And even though I was a writer, I didn't think of myself as a writer. And so the internet was quite young at the time too. So there was not much online, no real resources to figure out how to do that. So it took a while to figure it out, but then eventually I did start sending in journals, sending stories into journals, and I started getting published in literary journals. I was working as a psychology professor by then. So I only had time to write at night and on the weekends and in the summers. And I was also writing academic articles at the time and teaching and over time doing administration. So it was hard to find time to write. And I kept my creative writing really separate from my psychology work because, you know, psychology prides itself on being an empirical discipline. So the whole point of academic writing in psychology is to not write fiction, right? So I didn't really want to talk about my fiction writing very much with my colleagues. Of course, some people did know that I was writing, but mostly I just didn't talk about it until actually I won the Iowa Short Fiction Award in 2018. And then my writing became much more public. I started doing things like panels and presentations and so on. And by then my novel had also been published. This is the novel, The Mask Collectors. And writing the novel was quite difficult. Writing and revising it was quite difficult with my academic job. And so that's why eventually, very recently, I decided that I was going to try writing full time. It was a rather scary decision to make, to resign from my faculty position at NYU. And it felt like a huge risk to take, you know, because I didn't know, and I still don't know, how my writing's going to go or whether I'll be able to sell any more books. But I decided that if I didn't try to really devote myself to it, I would never know whether I could, what I could do with it. So, and life is short. So I decided to go for it. And so here I am. I'm writing mostly full-time now, although I do have a small clinical private practice. So that's the story. And my educational background, my clinical psychology training helps a lot, I think, with my writing. I'm really interested in characters' motivations for what they do and how their history and background fits into their current life, and you know what's brought them to where they are, and what would make them transform, what kinds of events in the world would make them transform. Those things are important for character development. So I think the clinical psych perspective helps with that. My science background hasn't really come in much for my short fiction, but it definitely has for my long fiction, my novel. In my novel, The Mask Collectors, I brought in a fair bit of science, and I'm continuing to do that in the novel that I'm writing now. I like to base a story in real concepts, you know, things that we've found to be true based on scientific studies, and then stretch those concepts beyond science to more speculative ideas. So I like to bring in a hint of the supernatural or the mystical, or you know, something spooky that I find that fun to do.
So yeah, no, well, I think the background is very helpful for people to understand you know, what goes into your books. But can you maybe describe a little bit what your writing process is like? How do you come up with all the plots and the characters, etc.?
Okay, so usually the germ of an idea presents itself to me somehow, and then I start thinking about it, and over time it gets bigger and bigger and attaches itself to other ideas and experiences I've had. The initial idea can be something really small, like some experience I had or some minor incident or even something I read about, say in a news article, for example. For The Mask Collectors, I started with the idea of the placebo effect. That was something that I had studied in grad school. I wrote an MA thesis on it at the University of Chicago. That program was in social sciences, and it was the bridge, you know, from my biology background to my doctoral work in psychology. So I was in an interdisciplinary department, and my advisor was an anthropologist by training. And when I was writing this thesis, I really found it fascinating that his perspective really was so different from mine, because my perspective was biopsychological, you know, my perspective on the placebo effect. And so this idea of the two perspectives is something I eventually brought into this novel. And something else I wanted to say about, oh yeah, at the time that I was doing the master's, I was interested in connecting the placebo effect to Thovil. For those of you who haven't read the book or don't know what Thovil are, they're a kind of healing ritual in Sri Lanka. And it's something I talk a lot about in my book. So anyway, it turned out to be impractical for my thesis to actually study the Thovil and possible connection to the placebo effect, because getting access to Thovil in Sri Lanka is very difficult. You have to be part of the community and be there for a long time. I couldn't have just gone from U of C to study something like that. So that didn't work out, but I guess that idea of connecting the placebo effect to Thovil festered in my head for a long time and eventually came out in the novel. Mali, does that kind of give you an idea of how the characters, you asked about characters, right? It's pretty hard to say where characters come from. They sort of appear in my mind once I start thinking about an idea. They're often based on some small feature of someone I've met or that someone I know or read about. For example, there's a story in my short story collection. This is my short story collection. I guess I should plug my books. In that book, there is a story called Here in This America. And that story started with something I overheard in my gym many years ago. I heard the gym manager make this condescending remark to a woman who was part of the janitorial staff. And so some years later, I thought I was going to write a story having this remark in mind about a janitor. And then this character materialized in my mind, who was very different from the woman who had triggered this idea of writing the story. He was a middle-aged Sri Lankan man who had been in very different circumstances in Sri Lanka. His father had been a judge, and he had grown up, he had lived a pretty affluent life, but then he came to the United States and found himself in different circumstances and needed to get a job as a janitor. So once I had thought about that, then the character, who's not a real person, he fleshed himself out in my mind with a history and a family and a particular way of speaking. And that's how the characters happen. They're all probably mashups, of different people I've encountered, but they really create themselves. I think creating characters is really an unconscious process. It's almost like dreaming. And I don't think I'm the only writer who has that experience. I think it's something that happens to a lot of people.
Back to a little bit more, to explore the writing process a little bit more. Do you have any particular writerly quirks that you want to talk about here? A particular time of day that you like to write? Do you set daily targets of output like many other authors? Any other things that you might want to share?
Yeah, well, I have a lot of quirks, but as a writer, not as many. I used to write a lot at night when I had a full-time job, because that was the only time I had to write. But now I like to wake up in the morning and start to write soon after that. I write for most of the day when I don't have other things to do. I did set a daily target. I have set a daily target when I needed to get momentum going on a long writing project. So for the Mass Collectors and for the novel I'm writing now, for the first drafts, for like the first month or two, I tended to set a target like 5 or 10 pages a day. But then once the momentum gets going, then I just sit and write for as long as I can a day. And, sometimes I get stuck and then I'd go for a walk or chop vegetables or something, something that uses like the rule following part of my mind. Like if I go for a walk in a particular route, you know, I know that I have to remember to walk that route, right? So that takes care of one part of my brain. And I think that frees up the other part. So I can, then that tends to unblock my writing somehow. And in terms of quirks, the only thing that I've noticed very clearly, I can't work with any kind of sound. You know, it has to be silent unless it's like nature sounds, which I love. And I need to have closed doors. So even like a closet door that's open seems to be somehow distressing, but that's the only really weird thing.
I have a question from the audience here, asking whether you maintain a journal in your writing process, and do you find elements and objects that lend imagination to your work?
Do I find elements in objects?
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what he means. This is Fazil Chowdhury from the class of '98.
Okay. Yeah, I used to keep a journal, and I still occasionally do, but it's not a regular thing. So I have, I don't know if you can see behind me, but I have a whole series of notebooks that I've, you know, carried around with me, and then I jot down little things that I see or that interest me, or incidents, things like that. And then for a while, I used to keep a online journal where I'd write in interesting things that happened. I note down, if I hear people saying weird things, I sometimes note those down. And, you know, I've only ever done one writing workshop in my life, and that was at the Kenyon Review about a decade ago or so. And that was really helpful at the time. There was this idea of found objects and found lines that they talked about at this workshop. It was similar to this, what I had been doing, that you kind of collect all these little things from the world, and that all those things kind of come together, you know, in your head when you're writing. And I think that's what this person's talking about. In terms of specific objects, I do find it useful if I'm just stuck or not really able to, you know, find details for a plot or something, to go through old photographs. And actually last year or 2 years ago, I got an online picture frame, you know, where the pictures circle every so often. That has been helpful. But actual photographs, just looking through those has been helpful. And sometimes like old objects from school or something will trigger some memories, and that's helpful as well.
And of course, she also uses me as one of her journals as well, because she'll call me up every now and then and say, hey, do you remember way back when there was XYZ, this and that?
Yeah.
You know, provide the details.
Yeah, my brother has an amazing memory. So it's very useful to pick his brain about various incidents that I vaguely remember. He can remember phone numbers of, you know, family members from when we were 8. I don't know.
Okay, I have another question for you, Pony, from Mona Uman. What are some of the pressures that you feel as a writer from the world of publishing? She's curious to know if there's pressure for short story writers to write novels, as if there were a hierarchy between short stories and novels.
Well, I don't know if I would call it a hierarchy, but you know, I think short stories are easier to write, at least when you have a full-time job, because there's no complicated plotting that you have to do. And so, you know, they're very different. Short story writing and novel writing are very different. Pressure from publishers publishers do not like to publish short story collections. They're very, very difficult to publish because according to the publishers, people don't read short stories. Getting them published in literary journals is relatively straightforward, but actual, collections as books is harder. So in that sense, I suppose there's pressure for people to write novels, but I think writing novels is just a different sort of thing. And you really have to spend a lot of time, thinking out the plot. There are many more characters in a novel than in a short story. And each of those characters has their own personal story, right? And they all have to intersect in the plot. So it takes time and energy to do that. So overall, quite different kinds of writing.
Let's have a closer look at the books themselves now. Your two published books, the ones you've shown us so far, are quite different. Your first publication is a short story collection, and the other one is a mystery novel. But they were published very close together. Did you write them both around the same time? And can you elaborate on why you decided to go for long form fiction, and which one do you enjoy writing more?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the stories in The Water Diviner were actually written over several years. In the beginning, I didn't have any thought of writing a collection. I was just writing stories as and when ideas came up. And when they started getting published regularly in journals, I decided to try to write a whole series about the Sri Lankan immigrant experience. Making sure that I had different sorts of characters and different situations and exploring a range of ideas. And as I said, writing short stories is not really much like writing a novel. The Mask Collectors has a pretty complex plot. So it was really hard for me to write, unlike the short stories, which were relatively easy to do while I had a full-time academic job. It was harder to write the novel when I had the full-time job, because all these things were, all the different parts, had to be connected, and I couldn't keep track of how they were connecting because I kept having to do other things in between, right? I was doing this academic writing on the side as well. So I only got the novel done eventually by dedicating a whole summer to writing the novel, to finishing the novel, and then another summer to revising it. Overall, the process took about 4 years. And I think that, I loved writing short stories when I was doing it. But from now on, I think I'm going to be writing mostly long form fiction and nonfiction. Mostly because I enjoy bringing in these speculative ideas, and that's harder to do in a short story than in a novel. And so that's, and also, as I said before, they're easier to sell than short story collections.
Right. Okay. Now, what kind of, did you have to do much research when you wrote these novels, or was it largely a matter of imagination?
Yeah, of course, it has a lot to do with imagination, but I did a lot of research. I love doing the research. I like going down all these various rabbit holes and learning about new things. And that's really part of the fun of writing, other than the actual act of writing. That's a really fun part of it. I research everything, every detail that I want to get in. I tend to research. So, for example, one of the stories in The Water Diviner is about a woman whose hobby is growing roses. And I know nothing about roses, and I wanted to get into this character's head. So I researched on gardening websites and, about varieties of roses and how they're grown and when they're grown and all of that. Then there's another story about a lepidopterist. Again, I don't know all that much about butterflies. So I checked out some books from the library and learned about butterflies. And that way I could enliven the character, because then I knew, what the character would be thinking or doing. For the mass collectors, I researched a lot more than for the short story collection, for the short stories, because there were so many things that I didn't know about. Like I researched pharmaceutical companies, the FDA's drug approval process. I researched more about the placebo effect, even though I already knew a lot about that. And also Tovil and Hunyam. For those of you who don't know, Hunyam is black magic. Tovil are these healing rituals. And it's difficult to get information about those two things, Tovil and Hunyam, because they're secretive kinds of practices. So I did manage to find some people to talk to who had some personal experience with these things. But I also read a few academic books on the topic to get an idea, anthropological books about the actual rituals themselves. But it took a while.
Let's talk a bit about setting. So what made you decide to use Sri Lanka as the setting for your first novel and for many of the short stories in the book as well, given that it's obscure to many outside the country or outside Asia, where presumably a large chunk of the target readership is, particularly maybe readers in the US.
Right. Well, for the short stories, that was just the natural place for me to start. I think writing those stories was part of my process of acculturation to the US. Even though I had already been in the US for many years before I wrote those stories, acculturation, is a long process. So I wanted to write about the kinds of conflicts and challenges that immigrants face when they come here. And things like the push and the pull of the new country versus the old country, and how different attitudes conflict with each other, things like that. And I also want to explore how people's perspectives change when they come into this new place. For example, Mali, that we grew up in Sri Lanka with certain attitudes about social class. And those were fine, because they were normal back there. That was the way everyone was, or that was the way everyone thought. But then when I came here, I found that my perspective on that completely changed. Things occurred to me that had never occurred to me before. And it's not that there aren't issues about social class here, obviously, but it's just manifested differently. And so I was thinking about all of that, and I wanted to write about that. For the mass collectors, the mass collectors isn't really about immigrant experiences or anything like that. I had some different specific ideas that I wanted to explore. Like, for example, the way culture influences what people believe, and how those beliefs, which are often unconscious, really have a visceral influence on people. And I knew that I wanted the plot to involve the placebo effect and Tovil. And so obviously it had to be set in Sri Lanka, right? Because of the Tovil. I knew that I wanted, well, it's true that relatively few people in the US know about Sri Lanka, it seems. I once had someone ask me actually if Sri Lanka was near San Antonio. So, and
I had exactly the same experience when I was signing up for my freshman year in Austin at the University of Texas. This very kind middle-aged lady asked me where I was from, and I said I was from Sri Lanka. And she said, "Oh, is that near Round Rock?" She's about 30 miles away from Austin, so we've been there.
And you said, no, it's thousands of miles, right? Yeah, it's really, I mean, maybe it's not that strange because Sri Lanka really is a very small country and is obscure to a lot of people. But, you know, that can be positive or negative, I think, when it comes to writing, because some people might not pick up the book because they've never heard of Sri Lanka, but then other people might pick up the book just for that same reason. I think the fact that my novel is set in both New Jersey and Sri Lanka might have helped some people to overcome the strangeness of Sri Lanka, maybe. But in general, I try not to spend too much time worrying about whether it will appeal to people, because I think that really tends to block the flow of writing. So I just try to write what I want to write and then hope for the best. I was more concerned in the Mask Collectors with trying to represent the Sri Lankan parts accurately, you know, especially to not exoticize the rituals and the beliefs, but to be authentic about showing what they were.
Okay, now here's a question I think that'll be new to the hearts of the audience, the specific audience here. It seems like the school described in the Mask Collectors is based in Kodi. What made you decide to put Kodi in? And were the characters at all based on any of the people we knew back then?
Yeah, yeah, I've been to several Kodi reunions in New Jersey with Lisa and, you know, a bunch of other people. Hi, Lisa. And the reunions are at a place called Kirchenwald. It's a camp in a sort of a wooded area. And I was there one year when the ideas for the Mask Collectors were just germinating. And when I was going to bed that night, we were in one of those little cabins. I found this small scrap of paper that had been folded up and tucked into a little crevice near my bunk. And it looked like a piece of paper that had been there for a long time. It's kind of dirty and wrinkled. And I don't remember exactly what it said, but it was something vaguely mysterious, suggesting some sort of rendezvous. And I think that note was what morphed into the phone message that Angie left for Grace in my novel. And I think that's also when I decided to have this international school backdrop for the book. The school, for those of you who haven't read the book, the school in the book is called KIS also, but it's Kandy International School. So it's set in, the school is set in Sri Lanka, not in India, but in other respects, it is, you know, very similar to Kodi. And I also used Kirchenwald as the setting for the first chapter of the book where a murder takes place.
Hopefully that's never happened.
Hopefully that's never happened and never will happen. And the characters, no, none of the people are, several Kodi people have asked me this and no, none of the people are real Kodi people, but you know, there could be like some aspects of different people. As I said, I think they're all mashups and that could happen.
Okay. So why is the book called The Mask Collectors? How is it pertinent to the plot or the underlying theme of the book?
My agent and I brainstormed for a while about this title, trying to come up with something catchy that fit the book. I like this title because when I was writing the book, I always imagined the book cover having a mask on it, a devil dancing mask from Sri Lanka like this. This is actually one of those masks. And of course, there's a lot about Tovil in the book, and masks are worn by the exorcists in those rituals. And the title's also fitting, I think, because the masks are meant to be used in these sacred rituals, and not meant to be collected, you know, and so the title kind of implies that they're being misused. I don't think I can actually say more about that point without a spoiler, so I'll stay away from that. And also, finally, the novel has a lot to do with secrets and things being hidden, so masks are a good metaphor.
How did you come up with the ideas in the book, like the placebo effect, trance, the power of belief, big pharma, etc.?
Yeah, so the placebo effect, as I said, you know, that's something I studied. And trance and the power of belief actually have also been topics that I've studied quite a bit. They're connected to the research that I've been doing in psychology for the past decade or so. And I've been reading a lot about the corrupting influence that pharmaceutical companies have on academic research. It's actually pretty shocking. So I wanted to bring that in. And the actual plot of the novel is, of course, completely made up, but there are kernels of truth in all the different parts.
Looking at some of the incidents mentioned in the Mask Collectors, how much of this is based in fact? There are a couple of incidents in particular that I'm referring to that may seem a little bit difficult to believe for most readers. But as you know, these were things that we actually heard firsthand from our dad, who was a very educated and very skeptical kind of person. So maybe you can elaborate a little bit on a couple of those things.
Yeah, so many of the incidents are made up, but there are some that are based in fact. I assume that you're referring to the incident in the exorcism ceremony, right? For those of you who haven't read the book, one of the protagonists, Duncan, is an anthropologist who studies Tovil rituals. And he describes an incident that he saw at a Tovile. Tovile is the singular form of Tovil. Just at the moment when the exorcist supposedly casts a demon out of a patient, a spectator who's standing nearby shrieks and then jumps straight up into the air, like about 12 feet, high enough to touch the fronds of a coconut tree. So you can imagine that's pretty high. And that incident was something our dad had described to us several times when we were growing up. And it was something that he had seen when he was young at a Tovile that he had been at. I think it was, you know, some neighbor was having this ceremony done or something, and he happened to be present and he saw this. And every time he told us about this, we could tell that it bothered him, you know, that the fact that he couldn't explain it bothered him, because he was a very rational, skeptical kind of guy. And I think seeing someone jump all of a sudden like that, really high, was not, just seemed implausible to him, but he knew he had seen it. So I thought it would be an interesting detail to put in the book. There are a couple of other things. A similar thing in the book is the whole business of the tongue hanging out. For those who haven't read the book, there are a couple of mysterious deaths in the book in which corpses of the dead are found with their tongues hanging out. That is based on something real that I observed once in Sri Lanka. This was on a visit to a place called Katragama in the south of the island, where there's a big Hindu temple. And there's a festival there every year, and people from all over the island go there to participate in various kinds of rituals. So when I was there, I saw a lot of devotees in trance. You know, there's music and it's a very active kind of you know, it's a very evocative environment, incense and music and all of that. Anyway, there were a lot of people there in trance, dancing and chanting. And one woman in particular, I remembered really clearly, she was in trance and she was swaying and her tongue was hanging out. And her tongue was hanging out to an extent that seemed really implausible to me. I actually researched tongue lengths, as I do, and the average length of a tongue is 3.3 inches. And apparently, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, the longest observed tongue is 4 inches from root to tip. And what I saw, and that doesn't explain what I saw, you know, this woman's tongue was really very long. It was hanging down really far. And so, I mean, I was not the only person. It was not like I was in trance. There were other people with me and they saw the same thing. But I can't explain that. I don't know, you know, maybe because she was in trance and she was so relaxed, maybe the muscles of the tongue were relaxed enough that it looked that long. I don't know why, but it was such an evocative image that I thought it would be good to put in the book to illustrate, you know, sort of this mystery of things, things that you can't explain.
The book has a lot of reviews on Goodreads and Amazon. Can you perhaps give us an idea of what readers focused upon and what elements interested them most and what perhaps they found least credible in the plots?
Yeah, the reviews I've seen really vary a lot. Some people like the plot, other people like the atmosphere or the glimpses into Sri Lanka or the ritual aspects, and some people like the ideas behind the book. And there are also people who hate the book, but, you know, we'll not talk about that. One thing that I found curious is that some people mention that certain things are not credible, and that's totally understandable because there are things that in the book that are difficult to believe. But interestingly, the things that are mentioned are usually things that are absolutely based on fact. So for example, I've seen a couple of people say that it's so implausible that kids who went to an international school would stay in touch years later, right? So that we are all living proof that I didn't make that up. And then I've seen some people say that the nocebo effect is too far-fetched. The nocebo effect is like the dark side of the placebo effect, you know, just as it's the idea that drugs or treatments can sometimes have negative or harmful effects if you believe that that's going to be the case. And so it's the idea that suggestion can affect you both positively and negatively. And I didn't make that up, that's real. So that's interesting to me, you know, that people would pick out the things that really are true and think that those are implausible.
Okay, I think we probably need to get to Q&A pretty soon. So one final question on sort of your current projects. I know you're writing a couple of other books at the moment. Did your experience of writing The Mask Collectors and The Water Diviner influence how you're approaching the new books?
Yeah, I've written a new novel, which I'm now revising. I think I learned a lot about plotting while I was writing The Mask Collectors. And I'm trying to use that experience in the process of this revision. The challenge for me in writing a novel is to really balance character development with plot development. So I'm using my experience of writing The Water Diviner to create interesting characters and my experience of writing The Mask Collectors to develop the plot and trying to balance those two aspects of the book. I'm also writing a nonfiction book, which is related to the psychology work I've been doing. And that's on hallucinations and inner speech, normal inner speech that we all have as we go about our daily lives. And that's fun to do, but it's challenging because I want to write for a broad non-academic audience. And most of my nonfiction has been for an academic audience. So trying to do all the very factual stuff in a almost novel-like way is a challenge.
Thanks. So I think we need to move on to the Q&A. So I'll hand this back to Manjusha to field any questions and forward them on.
Sure.
Actually, I've got a question from the audience here as well, from Anju Taneja. Question is, Ruvanee's journey towards being a published writer of fiction is interesting. In today's context, where instantaneous success motivates youngsters in particular, what message would Ruvanee have for students about schooling and finding passion?
Schooling in general or about writing?
Schooling, that's what it says here, about schooling and finding passion.
Yeah, I mean, instantaneous success, I think, is hard. And if you're talking about discovering what your passion is, I think you just have to kind of follow your interests and, with young people, give them room to move towards whatever it is that interests them. And then, help them to explore that further. If the question is about writing specifically, if you want to develop as a writer, I think it's good to start with short stories and then try to get those published in good journals, because that'll give you a platform to move forward and make you more credible to publishers, if you want to get it out into the larger world, whoever that was.
If there are any other questions, you can unmute and ask away. I'll just start with my own question, Ruvanee. So I was actually very interested by your research that you've done in internal voices, and I'm also interested in how that may have, or did it, your own internal voice, has it influenced your work, or how does that work? What is internal voices, and did it influence you?
Yeah, so by internal voice, I mean like the thinking voice that many people have in their head, as they, like saying, you can do it, or, after this talk, I'm going to get a sandwich, or whatever it is, going on in your head. And some people have a more pronounced inner voice than other people. Some people actually have an audible inner voice. I don't. My head is completely silent. And that's actually why I got interested in this, because when from the psychology standpoint, when I started studying this, I thought when people told me that they had actually an audible inner voice, I thought, wow, that is so strange. That's such an unusual thing. And these were like normal, then they were not disturbed anyway. But it turns out that the vast majority of people actually have an audible inner voice, and I am the one that's a freak. So there are very few people, actually about maybe 10–15% of people who have the silent head, and most other people have this, audible experience. And so, yeah, that's something I've studied, and I've connected it to other kinds of auditory experiences people have, which people think of as hallucinations, but it turns out that there's a fair number of people who don't have any kind of disorder who also experience what appear to be hallucinatory voices, and that's been interesting to me.
Question from Shrikant Ramamurthy, class of 1980. And he's
Hi,
asked, and he's asked, which authors, academic or non-academic, have influenced you?
Yeah, so there's been a lot. I'm a really eclectic reader, so it's really hard to name individual authors because there are so many who are so different. But in terms of short story writing, I would say like Alice Munro. And in terms of other writers, there are so many that I admire: Tom Wolfe, Margaret Atwood, Tana French, you know, many that have influenced me in some way. I mean, just by reading them and thinking that these books are so awesome. My brother and I often share we often have book discussions. You know, he's a huge reader. He's probably the most well-read person I know. And so any book that I have read, I ask him whether he's read, and he asks me whether I've read the books that he's read. So we share those books, and that really increases my breadth of reading as well. I do find that it's very helpful to read every day for writing. And whenever I stop reading for a while, it tends to impoverish my writing. So I always try to keep reading every day.
All right, I have another question. You have a story called The Rat Tree, where there's a prison counselor who has to decide between walking past a tree filled with rats or past the inmates. And I'm wondering whether that stems from your own experience as a therapist who visited the jails, or the prisons. So would you like to talk about that? I'm sure you've been asked that before, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, that story, actually, the setting is based on a real jail where I worked, the Cook County Jail in Chicago, where I spent a year, not actually as an inmate, but as a therapist. And the experience I had while working there is represented in that story. It was it was a difficult place to work in the sense of the environment because of the way the inmates tended to react to the female staff and particularly the female therapists. But the story itself, about that elderly Sri Lankan man, that's all made up, of course. But that the setting itself is from my experience, yes.
And was that very intimidating to be in that setting, or were you did it take some time to overcome?
Absolutely. Absolutely. When I first went in there, it was absolutely very intimidating because, there aren't really many women who work there at all. And especially not, I was much younger and also, a grad student at the time. And this was a training experience, clinical training experience. And the only women who were there were like cops. And I think there were like a few administrative assistants or something in that unit. But other than that, and they were all very hardened to this atmosphere. And they were all, kind of seasoned. And I was not seasoned. So it was difficult because I didn't know how to deal with that onslaught of the kinds of comments and, just barrage of attitudes that I was getting all the time. But, the work actually, doing the therapy there was really interesting and kind of transformative in a way, because I really got to see that just because, you kind of label people that because they're in jail or prison that they're somehow so different from you, and they're not. They're just people who had such a hard life and had these very difficult circumstances, and they end up there, and you start to see them as human and no different really from yourself. And that's what that story is about.
Yeah, I'm really interested in how you develop the characters. I'm reading The Mask Collectors. I haven't finished it yet, so please don't tell me at the end. But I just want to know how you develop a character like, say, Bent or even Duncan and the main female lead, so that you get a feeling of both their strengths, their weaknesses. How do you go about that process?
Yeah, as I said, it's a little difficult for me to explain the process of developing a character, because I think a lot of it just happens automatically. It's an unconscious process. But I do, for the long form fiction, I do try to, when the ideas come to me, I do try to write down what each person's characteristics are, to sort of remind me as I go along. Whereas in the short fiction, I don't need to do that, because they're always, it's so small that I can kind of keep it in mind just as I'm writing. But with the longer form fiction, I do have to remember to somehow keep bringing in some flaw they have, or some, quirk they have, or something like that. And I would like to work more on developing characters in my long form fiction, as I said. That's something I'm working on for the new novel.
It's just that all of them are very complex characters. And, I think that you get a real sense of, what they're like. And you sort of say, what if I was with this person, what would I be picking up from them? And I just wonder how a writer can, you've answered it more or less. I mean, make those people so real to you.
Yeah. Well, thank you for saying that. I think it in a way, that that it's working if the character seems real to you as you're writing it, and the characters sometimes, once you sort of recognize them, maybe is the word for it, recognizing them as they are with all these different features, they often do things which sounds kind of crazy, I know, but the characters kind of do things that you don't necessarily want them to do. Like when you're writing the story, you have a plot line, right? You're going along and you want this thing to happen and this thing to happen. But once you've created a character and they have all these particular features and quirks, they may not want to do the things that you want them to do for the plot. In other words, like they don't fit into that mold that you're trying to set. And then you have to kind of let it go a little bit. Let the character, well, if you don't want to do this, then what would you do? And then you follow that like that. When you feel like that's happening, then I think that the character is good, like it's fleshed out. Because then it's not just me, Ruvanee perspective. I'm allowing some other part of myself that's, this character, right? That is controlling the narrative.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah, thank you.
There's another question in a review that I read. You don't immediately tell, you can't make out the sex or the gender or any physicality of your characters. You have to sort of go through this organic journey with them, and through their social settings, you sort of figure out who they are. And I feel some of the cues are very tuned into South Asian, the subcontinent. Do you have that in mind? Or do you think of some of your Western readers do you do this consciously, or is it coming out of a flow? Or have you tried to tune in for your Western readers?
Yeah, you're talking about the stories in The Water Diviner, yes?
Yes.
Yeah, that I think those stories were, that just happened that way. And I agree with you that, a South Asian reader would be more likely to immediately get what the characteristics of the person were. But on the other hand, I did want to overall try to, in the stories, kind of have the reader enter the person, enter the character. and to kind of blurring the boundaries between, you know, features of the character in the beginning, I think helped to do that. So it sort of promotes more empathy, I think, when you don't really know initially who the character is in that way, like are they male, female, you know, are they old, young, like that.
So you're tempting us to overcome our own biases and
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Because I found that quite a lot while reading your book.
Thank you.
Can I just ask something quickly about the characters that you were just talking about? You mentioned earlier that you go through pictures or photos and old photographs and things like that. Do you use them in some way in building a character by looking at images? Or do you keep something like that in mind as you write? It just struck me as something worth asking. Thank you.
Yeah, characters, yeah, I think looking at pictures can help with character building, particularly for physical features, you know, maybe not so much for the internal characteristics of the person, but for physical features, yes. And I think it does help to have an image in your mind of what the character looks like. So usually I do, once I think of a character, I do try to create in my mind a mental picture of the actual face and body of the character. Sometimes that just appears and I don't have to try. But if I don't have that, yes, there are times, now that you mention it, there are times that I have looked through photos and you know, tried to see like, okay, is the character like this person? Is it like this person? And then eventually you kind of find some image that fits with the character that you have in your mind. And that can be helpful.
Mary, there you go.
Yeah, I wondered if you could comment on the ending of Sonny's last game, which was such a fabulous ending, but it seemed almost too good to be true.
Yeah, it was maybe a little bit too good to be true. In the ending, the parents realized that you know, they've been so concerned about stereotyping people that they've been so concerned about being stereotyped or having people act in a certain way towards them that they have not realized that they themselves are stereotyping people. And, you know, they've been kind of pushing these people away because they're acting from their own past experiences, which have been difficult ones, right? There's a reference to how they grew up. And so they assume that all these people at this game are not supportive of them and that the kid is really being bullied and all of this. But the kid who doesn't have these kind of preconceptions is very innocent and he just does his thing. And so he's free of the prejudice that they themselves have. That's what I want to get.
Love that story. Thank you.
Mona.
Hi, Ruvanee. This has been
Mona.
so informative. It's been really informative. Thank you for being here. So I'm a huge fan of your short stories and your novel as well, but your short stories in particular, because there are certain themes that run through them, but then some of them are really unexpected. Like, for example, the story that you tell from the point of view of an autistic child. And then you do put yourself in the shoes of someone, you know, quite different from yourself, the autistic child, or told from a male perspective, told from a different social class. What are some of the challenges that you have in like conjuring up these perspectives?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the point really of that whole collection is to generate that kind of sense that we are not as separate as we might think we are, you know, that really kind of hoping that the reader will see themselves in these characters and yeah, to sort of blur the distinction between the self and the other, if you want to, kind of like that. Did I answer your question?
Well, I was thinking more from a writer's perspective. I mean, do you have to do a lot of research into figuring out how an autistic child might be thinking, or?
Well, with the autism spectrum thing, I know a fair bit about that, right, from my psychology work. Mm-hmm. So I use that. I also, there are a couple of people that I know who have some similar characteristics, so I use those as well. And I think the idea behind that was really to, again, show that, you know, this person who seems like they're so different really just needed time to get to this place. And that's what that little thing at the end is about, where she gets a note and she's talking about how this chrysalis, you know, needs time to get to the right stage.
Thank you.
Can you tell me more about this Tovile festival? What does it involve, and what is it like? Something similar in India, or?
I don't know if there is something similar in India. They're actually really amazing rituals. You know, they're, it sounds like it's a short thing, but it's not. These Tovil rituals go on like a whole night long, and they are done to be curative. So people who think that, you know, there are people who are ill usually. Tovil are done for people who are ill, and the belief is that, you know, there's some evil spirits or demons that are affecting them, and the idea is to remove them.
Okay.
But the Tovil are really performances. There are dances and chanting and, you know, really elaborate costumes, and there are all these structures that are built out of coconut leaves and various things to as part of the ritual. There's like a stage, essentially, even though it's not a stage that's set up high. It's a space where the family members and relatives and friends and all gather. And then there are these dances and drummers and chanting and theater, really. There's comedy, there's singing, all kinds of things. And it goes on for hours and hours into the night.
So you were saying it's exclusive, so you sort of needed to be invited, is it, to?
Yeah. I don't really think, well, I don't know if you have to be invited, but I can't imagine that anybody who didn't know the person would just go in and, you know, sit there. Seems unlikely. Unless, what do you think, Malia? Do you think you have to be invited? Probably, right?
Tovile, yes.
Yeah, I think you'd have to be invited, or at least, I mean, maybe people could stand like nearby and watch, but I think to actually get close.
Typically, you have to be either a relative or a close family member,
right,
or an invitee.
Right, and I mean, the idea that in the book, this guy, the protagonist who's studying the Tovil is American. And so for that to happen, you'd really need to spend a lot of time with the community and, you know, get their trust and, you know, really embed yourself in the community. Couldn't just walk in and do that.
I think there's a question from Faisal.
Hi, Ruvanee. Love the discussion. can you tell me whether the devils are a little bit like jinns? You know, we consider jinns to be like mischievous. They enjoy the folly of others. They enjoy when things muck up. Are those attributes similar to the ones that you described?
You mean in the demons that are being cast out?
That is correct, yes.
I don't know if I don't think in exorcism ceremonies, I don't really, from what I've read, I don't get the sense that people think of those demons as like mischievous. I think they're more like, you know, malevolent towards the person that they are, that they've affected. So, yeah, I would say it's more than mischief. It's more like evil is the sense I get. Mali, wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. There's definitely a very dark element to the demonic position. It's sort of, I guess, more similar to a sort of Catholic type of perspective,
right?
You know, demons in the Catholic sense or the Christian sense.
Yeah, I think, you know, people in, I know I've heard about the concept of the jinn, and I know that, you know, sometimes in my psych research, I've come across this actually, that there are people who will feel like they've been possessed by jinn. But in the Sri Lankan context, I think people are more afraid of those kinds of influences than people who talk about jinn appear to be of jinn.
Yeah, I thought it was really interesting that you said that, because you know, I lived in Sri Lanka in the late 80s, and I vaguely recall something along those lines, and I was just trying to find some clarity on that. But thank you for the detail.
Yeah.
Right. I want to thank you, Ruvanee and Sriyan, for putting this together for us. Sriyan, it must be very late for you in Bangkok at this time. Thank you so much. Ruvanee, thank you. It's been really insightful into your writing process and going through how you've come up with characters. Very interesting. Mr. Krause writes, thank you for sharing your writing experiences with us, Ruvanee. I found your insights very interesting. Suzanne also says, thanks so much, Ruvanee, for sharing. Just reading out in the comment box there. Yeah, so it's now social hour. So if anyone wants to just stay back and chat, they can. Or you're welcome to log off if it's very late or you have a thing to
Yes,
go.
I want to say thank you as well for again, Manjusha, for doing this. And thank you to my brother for volunteering and sacrificing himself in this way. And also thanks so much for all the questions and for being here. I really appreciate it. And I'll be here for a while if anyone wants to chat as well.
Yeah, thanks again, Manjusha.
Thank you, Sriyan.